Onto the UV, we're going to split the window and change it over to UV editor. And then in the top right corner, we're going to turn on display stretch. Working piece by piece, we're going to start with the base, and we're going to delete the back half, which I'll get to why we've done that later. And if we go up to select, in edge mode, we can select sharp edges. I'm going to deselect these ones in the middle. And I've already had a bit of a practice at what works well for this and what doesn't, so I know kind of roughly what edges I need to select. You can always duplicate the file and do this yourself. You don't have to save everything you do. And then I'm just going to mark seams on those ones and hit U for unwrap. And you can see it's done a pretty good job so far, but we can always make it better. So I'm using the add-on UV Squares. It's a free add-on. And with this piece here, we can use 2 grid by shape. Before we do that, we do have to press Tab to turn off UV Sync. And I'm just going to manually move this part up on the Y-axis. And you can see that just fixes up, just keeps everything even on the left. And then we're going to manually fix this area where the stretching's a little bit worse. So if we look on the model at where this part is, just turn UV Sync back on, you can see it doesn't move left or right on the model, it's just up and down. So if I move this to the left, you'll see it fixes the shading and makes it more even. That vert, by contrast, needs to come forward a bit because for some reason it leans forward slightly. And if we adjust the first one, we can then get that to that dark blue. The display stretch thing is a little bit like a heat map. So the dark blue is basically no stretch, it's completely flat. And we can then just work out where to put these verts. Now with the deleting of the back half, that was because I'm manually fixing up the stretching on some of these parts. I'd have to do it on both sides, and I want it to be equal. So again, because of my OCD, I'm going to fix it up on one half and then mirror it across. Now when you do that, the UVs will basically be stacked on top of each other. So the other half of this piece will be stacked perfectly on top of it, and it'll also be flipped. So you'll see when I get to that point that I need to flip the thing over. So I'm just adding in the mirror now and go back into edit mode, and you can see it doesn't look like there's any difference. But if I select that back half, you can see they're stacked on top of each other. If I go to text tools and disable sync, you'll see when I select flipped, all those faces are flipped. So you can simply scale those to -1 in whatever direction you want. And then I'm going to stitch these together. So just selecting these edges. I've got stitch set to V. I'm not sure if that's the default or not. And then we've reduced that down to basically 5 islands. In UV, we can select average scale, so everything's relative to each other. And then using UV Packer, we can pack them into the space. The bottom of the model is not going to be seen if it's used in game, so that can be shrunk down because it doesn't need that much texture space. And I'm just going to make a new collection for UVs, and then move the base to that. And then hide it, so as we go through, everything will be moved from the low poly collection to the UV as we've completed it. Same with this piece, again, because it's symmetrical, meaning four axes, or 2 axes, sorry, we can just delete 3/4 of it, select sharp edges, and then go through and remove the ones we don't need. So the top portion is all going to be one piece, so I'm just going to remove the extra edges it's added there. That piece on the side can be one piece, and we need to add in an extra edge for that cylinder in that middle part. And then if we unwrap that, let's see, go to UV Squares, we can select that part and move it to there. And that vert I've just moved there is just that part where it's on the low poly. It's just moved along slightly to merge together with the flat piece on the top. And you can see just moving that down fixes up the stretching. This piece again to grid by shape. I'm not going to fix the stretching on that yet because I'm going to do that when I've mirrored it all across. So mirror it on the X and Y. And then I'm just going to select the top half, and then on the UVs, make sure I've got active sync on. Active sync basically means what you select in edit mode is the same as what gets selected in the UV. But equally, you have to turn one off occasionally, because if you move a vert that's connected to another part of the model, it will then move that and it ends up messing up your UVs. It can be frustrating if you don't notice whether you're doing it or not. So select the flipped ones and scale them to -1. I think I used X or Y. So everything should be the right way around. Now I can select these edges and stitch them back together. That's now one long strip. Now turn on active sync. Let's find out where this edge is on the actual model. So it's right there on the side. And where I'd prefer it to be is right at the back of the model. So I'm going to mark that as a seam. And I'm just going to select all of this bottom part and move it away. And then if I just stitch it together on that bottom edge, it will literally move the seam to where I want it. The idea is to always have your seams somewhere that they're either completely hidden or that makes sense, because if you want a texture to wrap around something, you don't want a seam in the middle and then your texture somewhere else on the UV space, because it'll have a very noticeable break in the textures. With this middle bit, just stitching them all together again. These faces, the flat parts, they can be stitched. Now if you look at these parts, these are this part on the model. So we basically want to stitch that bottom edge, and the same on the other one for the other side of the model. And if we now select all the ones that have got stretching on, we can scale them uniformly so they all fix at the same time. When you've got lots of these strip pieces, it's good to have them all going in the same direction, either horizontally or vertically. Because as well, when you've got these strips, if they are at a strange angle on your UV map, it makes much more noticeable artifacts in your textures. You'll get that sort of anti-aliasing where you can see the pixels. So as before, just going to pack all that into the UV space. Important to use pack rather than re-unwrapping, because if you re-unwrap it, it will basically remove all the fixes you've made. Move that part to the UV collection and onto the next part, which is this bracket in the middle. As we did on the low poly, we can delete half and select sharp edges. And then we can just look at where we want it to join. So we can have that side wrap all the way around underneath, and it will obviously wrap up to the other side as well. I'm just going to keep those edges in for the moment because I'm going to stitch them together manually. We can remove all the ones around this small inset detail at the top. We'll probably stitch all that together as well, but for now we'll just mark seams and then go from there. So we get a nice square and flat unwrap. So there shouldn't be any stretching on any of this at the moment. That's fine. And then we can just separate these pieces and look at what they are and where they are on the model and what we can get away with stitching together. Any edges that are very noticeable, like right at the front of the model, we generally want those to be stitched together, just because we're going to be able to see if there's a break in the textures on those areas. So parts like that, for example, that can be all stitched into one long part. This is these edges here, so that can be stitched as well. And then just mirror that across. And again, half of it will be overlapping. So turn active sync on, and if we select it on the model, we can then move it off on the UVs. Disable sync, and we need to, I've accidentally deselected that, I need to move that off where it's stacked on top of the other one, and then go to text tools and select the flipped parts. It's just not done it for some reason. That's not working because it's still flipped, but it's not saying it's flipped. So I'm just going to scale it to -1 anyway, and that should then do what I want it to do. That's it. That part now stitches together on the front, and that part at the front. These are the sides that wrap round underneath. We can sort of see what's stitched together. Now go to UV Packer, just pack that all into the space, and it straightens everything up quite nicely. And there's no stretching on any of that, so there's nothing to fix. As you can see, once you get in the habit of it and you kind of know how it's going to work, it's quite quick and simple for each part. Again, it's not even worth using mirror here because there's only 2 parts, and there's going to be three seams, one for the strip around the middle and another for the sides to be kept off. This gun part, just going to select sharp, and just going to deselect these front ones just so this whole front panel unwraps as one piece with the chamfer. Going to add in an edge split there, sorry, a seam there, so that it unwraps that front part from the bottom rather than from the top, because it'd be very noticeable on the top. And in an edge in the middle of those cylinders so that they unwrap properly. And if we mark all those seams and unwrap, we can see if we've got any stretching anywhere. Doesn't look like we do. And then it's just a case of stitching anything together we can that will make it smaller in the UV space. You ideally want as few of these UV islands as possible. That can be stitched to there because it's not going to overlap at the sides anywhere. Parts like this bit, they can be snapped to the grid with UV squares. This part can have the bits at the sides stitched on. Same both sides. And you can see on the model it just removes that seam. There's very minimal stretching on that front piece. You can see on the top right of the thing. I'm just going to pack that. And those parts aren't ideal because they're very thin and they take up a lot of space. But I'm going to leave them as they are for now. Like I say, there's not a lot of stretching on most of the model, so it seems a bit pointless to worry about that. can always click the pack button again to see if you get a better result. But we'll be doing that all at the end anyway, once we've joined everything together. Onto the bracket that holds the ammo drum. I'm going to select sharp edges, and I'm just going to increase the threshold of the sharpness, just because it removes some of these inner ones, and it just saves some time having to manually select or deselect them. These parts can be as one. If I remove those edges, they won't get selected for seams. I want to add in seams in some of these places and remove them from others. Going to need one there for this whole ring for the cylinder, so it unwraps as a strip. This can be turned into a strip using UV squares, and if we pack that, it packs quite nicely, fills up a lot of the space. And then lastly, we're onto the drum. So as you can see, it doesn't take long to do all of this. So using select sharp edges again, it's not really done a great result on that, I don't think. So I'm going to deselect these ones and add in the seam there, and so that the lid basically, it doesn't matter if there's a separation for the lid. We'll do the inner part on the under half. On this square bit, we can just remove 3 of the edges, and then it will just unwrap as a strip. Same as on the top of the bracket we can do for that handle, because it's essentially the same shape. Just remove those inner edges. I think I'll leave the other ones in, and we can just stitch that once it's unwrapped. So unwrap that whole side of the barrel. Just disable UV sync, and then we can do 2 grid by shape with UV squares again. These parts are just parts of this handle. So if we stitch them from the middle part, the flat part, they'll just align themselves nicely to that. I'm not sure if it's the defaults, but it's V to stitch, and if you want to flip which islands stitch into which, you press I believe. You kind of get a ghost image appear, and then you just click anywhere to confirm it. Oh, that's just the end part of the box that connects the ammo part to the gun. That's fine as it is. We can pack that. And that whole section is done. So I'm just going to save it. And if we now look at the completely unwrapped model, they are all still separate parts. So we need to join them together, because we want this to all unwrap into one UV space. And you can see they're all where they still were, but they was all overlapping. So if we just repack that, and you get this percentage number underneath that says how efficient it's been. If you keep re-clicking the pack button, then you get a higher number. And you can see if there's, for example, this is a really long strip. If we cut this in half and repack, we get a more efficient result. That is the underside of the base, which we're not going to need at all because you're not going to look at it. So we can untick rescale UVs, and that will keep that part small and basically unused. Just going to save that. Just so that we give a bit more UV space, more texture space to areas that have got normal details on, we're going to select these inside parts of these pivot wheels and reduce them in size, because you can barely see them. So it makes a lot more sense to give more texture space to the parts you can. So those parts are the outside of those wheels. So I'm going to double the UV space there because it's got to capture all those bolts. This part that's got the bolts at the bottom and the handles on, I'm going to double that, and I'm going to double the front of the gun again because it's such a prominent part and it's got some very fine details on it. It just makes it a much more efficient way of packing them together. And as you can see, I'm getting up to 73% efficient on that packing algorithm. So I'm going to stick with that one at 73.5. And just making sure I save it so I don't lose it. And one other thing I want to do while we're in the UVs is just save out the UV templates. You just go to UV export template, and I'm just going to change that to 4K because that's what I'm going to do most of my maps in. And we'll see you in the next part.